Okay, thank you for joining us again. Welcome to the second extract from Stave 3 of A Christmas Carol. Again, I'll read through this extract first of all and then analyse the key language and talk to you about themes and ideas. The timings will be below if you want to jump straight to the analysis. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from the tops of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down into the road below and splitting into little artificial snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, and with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been ploughed up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and waggons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire, and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavoured to diffuse in vain. For the people who were shovelling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile far than many a wordy jest, laughing heartily if it went right and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great, round, pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the street in their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples, clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks, that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shufflings ankle-deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squat and swarthy, setting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and, in the great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish, set forth among these choice fruits in a bowl, though members of a dull and stagnant-blooded race, appeared to know that there was something going on, and to a fish went gasping round and round their little world in slow and passionless excitement. The grocers, oh, the grocers, nearly closed with perhaps 2 shutters down or 1, but through those gaps such glimpses. It was not alone that the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that the blended scents of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, the candied fruits so caked and spotted with molten sugar as to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and pulpy, or that the French plums blushed in modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress. But the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other at the door, crashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter, and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humour possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that the polished hats with which they fastened their aprons behind might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection, and for Christmas doors to peck at if they chose. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with their gayest faces. At the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings innumerable people, carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revellers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in the baker's doorway, and taking the covers off as their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. And it was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner-carriers who jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humour was restored directly. For, they said, it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day. And so it was. God love it, so it was. In time the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all these dinners in the progress of their cooking, and the thawed blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if its stones were cooking too. "Is there a peculiar flavour in what you sprinkle from your torch?" asked Scrooge. "There is, my own." "Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?" asked Scrooge. "To any kindly given, to a poor one most." "Why to a poor one most?" asked Scrooge. "Because it needs it most." "Spirit," said Scrooge, after a moment's thought, "I wonder you, of all the beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment." "I?" cried the Spirit. "You would deprive them of their means of dining every 7th day, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all," said Scrooge. "Wouldn't you?" "I?" cried the Spirit. "You seek to close these places on the 7th day," said Scrooge, "and it comes to the same thing." "I seek!" exclaimed the Spirit. "Forgive me if I am wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family," said Scrooge. "There are some upon this earth of yours," returned the Spirit, "who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us." Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible as they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost, which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. Okay, and that is the end of this extract. Let's have a look at what Dickens is doing in these long descriptions of the Victorian streets and of the shops and of people's preparations on Christmas Day. So we start with this reminder that the weather is severe. So as we return to the streets of London, Dickens reminds us of the cold and harsh conditions. Thinking about your AO3, you'll know that conditions were very difficult for those living in poverty who wouldn't be able to keep warm during these harsh winters. And just think back to those men that we saw in Stave 1 trying to keep warm as they crowded around that bonfire. As we move through the streets, Dickens presents us with the scenes of people scraping the snow from the tops of their houses, and we see this joy from all the children as the snow falls from the rooftops. So there's joy and happiness even in this miserable weather, although as people scrape snow from the rooftops, the children are excited to see it fall to the street below. By showing people enjoying themselves despite the cold, Dickens illustrates how people become more joyful at Christmas time. So they're less likely to feel the effects of this cold and freezing weather, they're more likely to look for the fun that it can bring them. Still, he describes the gloomy sky and shows how the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, presenting the darkness and dinginess of the Victorian streets despite the fact that it's Christmas Day. But then he immediately contrasts this by describing this mist falling in the streets as being as if all the chimneys in Britain had caught fire and were blazing away. And this evokes the idea of blazing fires indoors, just like the fire in the hearth that the Ghost of Christmas Present conjures in Scrooge's room in the previous extract that we looked at. So we have this use of juxtaposition between the dark, melancholy streets, but the warmth and coziness inside the houses. And this reflects really the stark difference in conditions between the wealthy and the poor. So those who are already inside, warm, ready for Christmas Day, they're sitting nice and snugly by their fires, while others are out in the streets, cold, will remain there. So we have this use of juxtaposition all the way through. You'll see as well the house fronts that look black, the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs. Dickens repeatedly uses juxtaposition throughout this extract to illustrate the differences in conditions throughout Victorian London. He notes that there was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, but there was an air of cheerfulness abroad. So even though there's nothing very cheerful in the scene, this air of cheerfulness suggests that people are happy despite the gloomy weather at Christmas time. Again, Dickens is evoking here the magic of the festive season, suggesting it has an almost transformative power, and indeed it is transforming Scrooge. So at Christmas time, everything is seen in its most positive light. Everyone's spirits are lifted. He's talking about Christmas as this time which is capable of bringing everyone together and spreading joy throughout the community. As people are shoveling away on their rooftops and in their front drives, people are calling out to one another from the parapets and throwing snowballs. So Christmas is drawing people together, creating this sense of playfulness and community. So this is the world which Scrooge ignores, but which he could be a part of if he opens himself up, if he changes. And then we have this lengthy description of all of the food that is on offer. Note that Dickens describes the poulterer's shops still being half open and the fruiterers radiant in their glory. So the description of these shops reminds us of what's available with the money, reminds us of what is available to those with money to spend at this time of year. The shops are described as radiant, so they're giving off light, again suggesting that they've been transformed by the magical touch of this season. So we have this long description, and you could pick out lots of language that is worth analysing here, but it's so lengthy. I'm just going to kind of jump to the key concept here, which is this lengthy description of the food that is available to purchase, and he describes it in this sort of mouth-watering way, evoking ideas of plenty and abundance. So the wealthy are able to indulge themselves with all of these things. However, to the poor, these are unaffordable luxuries. All of this food can be transformed into a Christmas feast if you have the money with which to purchase it. But in a moment when we see the poor of London, we see that they aren't able to afford such incredibly luxurious food. They have to make do with something simpler. So the description continues, and we also see the customers, and this is Christmas morning, eager and hurried in the hopeful promise of the day. So Dickens creates this sense of sort of pleasant, joyful chaos as shoppers rush to make their last purchases in preparation for their Christmas dinners. And this familiar scene, which we recognise even today, is bound up in these ideas of Christmas tradition, all of these families preparing to come together and feast and celebrate, all of these people buying things at the last moment, trying to make sure that the day is just perfect. And some of them are doing things, they're leaving their purchases on the counter, then coming back to get them, and then people are making mistakes with how much they're paying and all of these sorts of things. So there's this sense that no one's really paying too much attention to what they're doing because the excitement and the slight mania of Christmas has made everyone a little bit frantic. But soon the steeples call people to church and chapel. So Dickens also reminds us here of Christmas's religious significance as everyone begins to hurry from the shops and they go off to church. Remember, thinking again about your AO3, that the Victorian era was characterised by its strict adherence to Christianity. So it was expected that people would be faithful, that people would follow the teachings of Christ, that people would go to church, that people would observe religious ceremonies. And it's interesting, isn't it, that Scrooge himself doesn't appear particularly religious. Think back to Stave 1's description of him as an old sinner who needs to change his ways. So over the course of the novel, the spirits, the ghost of Christmas past and present and future, bring his behaviour more in line with Christian teaching. He starts to live a more Christian life, treating others as he would wish to be treated himself, opening himself up, helping those less fortunate. And this leaves just the poor, who are heading backwards and forwards and carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. So the sight of these people particularly interests the spirit. He's particularly interested in scattering his torch's incense on the dinners of the poor, suggesting he takes a keen interest in the well-being of the less fortunate. So he chooses to spread his Christmas magic on the food of the poor people of the city. So he's setting an example as well to Scrooge. Just like the ghost of Christmas present, Scrooge also has the potential to transform the lives of the poor, but he doesn't need a magic torch. All he has to do is share his wealth, is share some of the privilege that he has with those around him. So this torch has a kind of magical power, If there were ever any angry words between people carrying their food home, or they've jostled each other, he sprinkles some of this incense on them and their quarrel is resolved. So this seems to have an almost transformative power of its own, this incense, as it reminds people that they shouldn't be arguing at Christmas time. So again, Dickens is reminding us that the festive season is a time for togetherness and harmony. It's a time when people should forget their differences and forgive, and should enjoy and appreciate this day. Scrooge asks the spirit what this incense can do. Does it have any flavour? Can it be sprinkled on any food? But the spirit notes that he gives it specifically to the poor. And the ghost's choice to favour the poor, to give preferential treatment to the poor people around him, reminds us that they are deserving. So you'll remember from some of our earlier videos that it was commonly believed in Dickens's time that if people were poor, it was because they were lazy. That if people were poor, it was because they hadn't worked hard enough or done enough to change their circumstances. And Dickens, remember, as a child, had been in a workhouse as a result of his father's bankruptcy, and he knew that there was no laziness there. He knew that poor people ended up there often because of circumstances quite beyond their control. So it's important to Dickens to highlight the fact that the poor are not necessarily poor because they're lazy or undeserving, that often it's to do with a whole multitude of factors. But Dickens also reminds us that these people are being neglected by the wealthy people around them who have the power to improve their lives, people like Scrooge. So the ghost favours the poor because he sees that he can improve their situation the most and because they deserve it. The Christmas spirit can be found in the poor just like in the rich, and the ghost doesn't recognise people's different classes. He doesn't focus on those who have the means to afford things. He focuses on those who are in need. So, this next little section in which Scrooge seems to accuse the spirit of depriving people of their means of dining on every seventh day is to do with something quite specific that was taking place a couple of years before Dickens published this novel. So, Dickens is referring to a law which would have prevented the poor from using their ovens on Sundays. So, already laws against bakers using their ovens on Sundays, but the plan was that these laws would be expanded. Now, due to long working hours, Sundays were often the only day when the poor would have time to cook a hot meal for themselves. So the purpose of the law was apparently to prompt people to spend their Sundays in worship and in prayer, but Scrooge accuses the ghost, a religious spirit, of supporting this idea of closing these bakeries and preventing the poor from cooking on Sundays. And Dickens is using this moment really to criticise the foolishness of these laws. So Scrooge is suggesting that the ghost is blessing the poor while at the same time supporting them not being able to cook or eat heartily on Sundays. And the ghost quite firmly reminds him that this is not something that he believes. He says, "There are some upon this earth of yours who claim to know us, and that they do their deeds of passion and hatred and selfishness and so on in our name." So Dickens uses the spirit's reply to criticise those who would do cruel or proud things and claim that their behaviour is Christian. So this moment is attacking really the hypocrisy of the Victorian era, in which people were quite content for the poor and the vulnerable to be placed in workhouses or be unable to use their ovens on a Sunday, but those people supporting those rules would still believe themselves to be good Christians and morally correct. And Dickens is pointing out the foolishness in this. He's pointing out the hypocrisy. You cannot at once say that you are being a good Christian, but telling the poor that they can't use their oven on a Sunday because they should spend it in worship instead, when a law like that will only cause their suffering. So, finally, our attention is drawn to the fact that the ghost is able to change size quite easily. He can accommodate himself to any place with ease. So the ghost is able to fit himself into any place with ease, and this suggests that the Christmas spirit can be found anywhere, regardless of wealth or class or status. So the fact that this spirit that represents the Christmas spirit, the spirit of Christmas itself, it can shrink down, it can fill any space, it can go anywhere. It's not restricted. It doesn't only go to the homes of the wealthy, but it crouches down and fits into the smaller houses of the poor as well. Okay, So, sorry, that was a little bit longer than intended, but hopefully that's been useful and has helped you to understand a section of the text that can be a little bit complex and a little bit impenetrable at first glance. In our next extract, we will have a look at a really important moment, the first appearance of the Cratchit family, and we get a glimpse of what Bob's life is like beyond Scrooge's miserable little office. Okay, thanks for listening. I hope that was useful.